This video is brought to you by Ground News.
Arkansas. Here, the swamps and bayous of the fertile Mississippi Delta meet the country's largest cluster of mountains between the Rockies and Appalachians. A mostly rural state, it's home to a number of small cities, some of which have become economically vibrant boomtowns. The natural state is an all too often overlooked corner of the country, packing a beautiful landscape, important history, kind people, and some really fascinating cities and towns into the lower 48's smallest state completely west of the Mississippi. Hello and welcome to That Is Interesting. I'm your host Carter. This is the U.S. Explained, episode 26, Arkansas. According to the Köppen climate classification, the entirety of Arkansas sits within the humid subtropical climate zone, with hot summers, mild winters, and high humidity. Out of the 50 states, it has roughly average levels of humidity, but like much of the South, ranks high in average temperature, sunlight, and precipitation. It's the 12th sunniest state in the country, as well as the 12th warmest, with an average temperature of 60.09 degrees Fahrenheit, and is the country's 10th rainiest state, getting an average 49.72 inches of precipitation per year. Temperatures and rainfall are spread fairly evenly throughout the state, though northern Arkansas tends to be slightly drier and cooler than the south, while snowfall is most common in the state's north, especially around the Boston Mountains. It deals with fairly frequent floods and tornadoes, and to a lesser extent hurricanes that come inland from the Gulf of Mexico, as well as earthquakes caused by the New Madrid Fault Zone in neighboring Missouri. The entire state sits in the central time zone. Arkansas is nicknamed the natural state. It's a fitting nickname for a state home to a significant amount of wilderness. The Ozarks and Ouachita Mountains occupy its northwestern half and make it arguably the only true mountain state between the Appalachians and Rockies. Though stretching into Oklahoma and mostly located within Missouri, the Ozark Plateau is at its most mountainous in Arkansas. The highest range of the Ozarks, the Boston Mountains, stretch across northwest Arkansas, and the state's Wajaji Summit is the highest point in the entire plateau. Further south across the Arkansas River, the Ouachita Mountains climb even higher. At 2,753 feet, or 839 meters, the Ouachita's Mount Magazine is the highest point in the state. More than half of Arkansas is covered in forests, and beautiful rivers and lakes wind through the mountain ranges to the valleys and bayous of the southeast. The nickname takes up the bottom of Arkansas's license plate, which depicts its name on the top along with a depiction of a diamond on a blue background. The diamond has become a symbol of the state, thanks to what is one of the coolest and most unusual state parks in the country. In the middle of the forest in southwestern Arkansas, not far from the town of Murfreesboro, is a large patch of dirt looking almost like a farm that hasn't yet been planted. Indeed, it used to be one until the farmers kept finding diamonds in the dirt. The top of an ancient volcano that had since eroded away, the soil there is filled with diamonds. Called Crater of Diamonds State Park, it's the only diamond mine in the world that's open to the public for mining. People come out with shovels, dig in the dirt, and often do end up finding diamonds. It was open to the public in 1972, and since then, visitors have found 35,000, on average close to 700 a year. The largest ever found in the U.S., a 40-carat diamond called Uncle Sam, was discovered there in 1924. The diamond serves as the centerpiece of Arkansas's flag. The flag shows a white diamond with a blue outline on a red field. Within the blue sit 25 white stars, representing Arkansas's status as the 25th state admitted to the Union, while inside the white diamond the word Arkansas is displayed in blue, alongside 4 blue stars, 1 above and 3 in a triangular formation below the state's name. The 3 lower blue stars represent the 3 countries Arkansas had belonged to when it was admitted: France, Spain, and the U.S., while the 4th star, added later, represents the Confederacy. There have been a few attempts to change the official meaning of that 4th star, but so far they've been unsuccessful. The three also represent 1803, the year the Louisiana Purchase made Arkansas part of the United States, and the fact that it was the third state created from the Purchase. Overall, I think it's a pretty nice looking flag. The state's name can be traced back to the Quapaw, who lived throughout the entirety of what is now the state, as well as a number of neighboring states. Though they called themselves the Ogapa, the Illinois, a confederation of numerous tribes living in nearby Illinois and Missouri, as well as other Algonquian speakers, referred to them as the Arkansas, or people of the South Wind. The Quapaw arrived in the region as part of the so-called Degihan migrations, of a single people from the Ohio Valley west, eventually settling in different parts of the country and forming different peoples. Some Degihan migrants who continued further north, the Kaw, were called people of the South Wind as well by Algonquian speakers, who gave them the very similar name of Kansa. The area they lived in would eventually be named Kansas after them, so the fact that the two states have names that are spelled so similarly to one another isn't a coincidence at all. They come from the same root word. Arkansas is pronounced differently, with a silent S at the end, because it has been Gallicized, turned French. French fur traders pronounced Arkansas as Arkansas, adding an S to make it plural, but keeping it silent in the French fashion. They gave the name to the river which had its mouth in the Quapaw homeland, one of the longest in the country. Interestingly, it's pronounced the Arkansas River in every state it flows through except Kansas, where they pronounce it Arkansas, like the name of their own state. The southernmost county of the Missouri Territory, which the river flowed through, was named Arkansas County for it, and when the county was split off to become its own territory and later state, the name remained. Interestingly, there were disagreements over both the spelling and pronunciation of the territory and later state for quite some time. The spelling was often anglicized to match the French pronunciation and end in a W instead of an S, while vice versa, the pronunciation was sometimes anglicized to match the French spelling and was called Arkansas. It wasn't fully cleared up until the state legislature officially decreed the French pronunciation and spelling that we know today in 1881. The U.S. Explained has come a long way since I started the series nearly 4 years ago, and we've still got plenty more videos yet to come. Because of that, it's fun for me when we reach certain milestones. As Arkansas is the 26th video in the U.S. Explained, we're not quite halfway done with the 56-part series yet, but this is state number 25, and so we are officially halfway through the 50 states. On top of that, it's the last state I'm covering that I would consider to be fully located within the American South. We have a few more states coming up, Texas, Oklahoma, West Virginia, and Florida, that have some partial claim to southernness, at least in specific parts of the state. But Arkansas is the last state that I'd say is indisputably completely southern across the board. My uploads have definitely slowed down in recent months, but I have a pretty good excuse, at least I think so. I've spent the last 6 months on the road, traveling across America and filming for this series. So far, it's taken me to 34 different states, 2 U.S. territories, 2 Mexican states, and 2 Canadian provinces. I've visited Arkansas in the past, so hopefully I'll still be able to share some of my own observations and speak a bit to what it feels like to actually spend time in the state. But what this means is that starting with the next episode in the series, Michigan, every video going forward in the U.S. Explained, all 25 state and 5 territorial episodes, will feature on-site clips and interviews. As much of the footage as makes sense, though not all, will have been taken by me or my brother Quinn, including all the thumbnails. I've currently taken nearly 10,000 photos and videos throughout this trip alone for the series. Perhaps most importantly, it allows me to write and speak much more authoritatively to not just the history and geography of each upcoming state and territory, but really get a feel for the culture and just the feeling of being there. All the little things that really make a place what it is, but that you can't find online or speak to as well without actually having seen it for yourself. Throughout the course of this trip, I've collected 91 pages of notes and observations on the places I've visited that I'll go back and go through as I write each episode. I'll get back to this episode, but I thought you'd be excited to hear where we'll be taking the series next. Arkansas takes up 52,035 square miles, or 134,771 square kilometers, placing it pretty much right in the middle of the 50 states in terms of land area at number 27. It's slightly smaller than Florida and slightly larger than Alabama, roughly similar in size to the countries of Greece or Tajikistan. Size-wise, it doesn't look too out of place compared to its neighbors to the east, but it's significantly smaller than most of America's large western states. For the third time, we've moved west of the Mississippi River, the country's traditional east-west dividing line. And looking at these 24 states west of the river, only 2 are smaller than Arkansas, Hawaii and Louisiana. As Louisiana is only partially west of the river, with a significant section, including the cities of New Orleans and Baton Rouge, lying to its east, Arkansas holds, to some degree, the distinction of being the smallest state in the West, at least if we're looking at states in the lower 48 that sit completely west of the Mississippi. 3.07 million people call Arkansas home, which places it slightly on the lower side of the states by population at 33rd out of 50, slightly behind Nevada, but slightly more populous than Kansas, similar to Bosnia or Albania. It's one of 19 states that has fewer residents than the U.S. territory of Puerto Rico, which is slightly larger at 3.21 million people. Arkansas is similarly in the lower middle of the pack by population density, with its 59 people per square mile or 23 per square kilometer, placing it at 34th, right between its neighbors to the east and west, Mississippi and Oklahoma. Though Mississippi slightly outpaces it in sheer population, when looking at density, Arkansas is the most sparsely populated state in the entire American South, a relatively rural state in a part of the country nearly a quarter of Americans call home. Arkansas sits in the south-central part of the country on the western edge of the region known as the South, and borders 6 other states. Missouri sits to its north, Tennessee and Mississippi to its east, Louisiana to the south, Texas to the southwest, and Oklahoma to its west. The eastern border with Tennessee begins at an oxbow separating the creatively named Island Number 20 from the western bank of the Mississippi River, and from there follows the Mississippi downstream. Especially in the low-lying south, the Mississippi River winds and bends as it follows the path of least resistance to the Gulf of Mexico, as everything from natural causes like floods and earthquakes to man-made diversions cause the river to bypass these bends and take a more direct route to the Gulf. The original borders remain in place, following the oxbow lakes and streams that remain where the river once flowed. These oxbows define much of Arkansas's eastern border with both Tennessee and Mississippi. Memphis, Tennessee's second largest city, sits on the river right across from the state, suburbs like West Memphis and Marion located on the Arkansas side. Just downstream of Memphis, it changes to a border with Mississippi, following the river south to a spot on a small island just outside the town of Eudora, where it leaves the river and turns west, becoming a straight east-west border, with Louisiana lying to the south. The Arkansas-Louisiana border runs for nearly 167 miles or 268 kilometers to a spot near the small community of Doddridge. It moves north from there for nearly 37 miles or 59 kilometers, with Texas sitting to the west until it reaches the Red River. Just south of the river, it passes through one of the most interesting state border cities in the country, Texarkana. Texarkana is particularly unusual not just because of its name, made by combining parts of the names of Texas, Arkansas, and Louisiana, which is close by but doesn't encompass any of the city. State borders in the U.S. often follow rivers, and major cities and towns often develop along rivers, so plenty of American towns and cities have suburbs or secondary urban cores located in different states. Even in cases where a city develops along a straight line boundary, rarely is the city center split right down the middle. Kansas City, for example, is centered in Missouri, while Kansas City, Kansas has a smaller downtown a few miles away. Though the Texas side has a slightly larger population, the border slices right through downtown Texarkana, following one of the main streets in town, State Line Avenue, and even splitting individual buildings like the train station, police station, jail, courthouse, and post office directly in two. Because of this, Texarkana is functionally a single city. Though split between 2 states with 2 different state and local governments, collectively its urban area is the 4th largest in Arkansas, home to 79,000 people in it and its suburbs, though about half live in Texas. In order to avoid local government being an absolute logistical nightmare, the city governments have made significant changes in order to work together as much as possible. The 2 police departments use the same building, even the same room, with a state line drawn in the floor, and share information about cases, while 2 separate district courts, the Western District of Arkansas and the Eastern District of Texas, both use the same federal courthouse, with the border running right through the center of the building, all the way down to the judge's chair, which sits right on the state line, so while presiding over cases, they'll always be in both Texas and Arkansas. It's the only federal building in the entire country located within two separate states. Perhaps most consequentially for locals, though, anyone living in the city of Texarkana, Arkansas, is exempt from Arkansas state income taxes. Texas has no income tax, so to keep the residents of the Arkansas side from flocking west across the border, the state legislature passed a law keeping Texarkanans from having to pay an income tax. From Texarkana, the border follows the Red River a few miles west before turning and following a straight line north for 119 miles or 192 kilometers, with Oklahoma lying to the west. In the city of Fort Smith, Arkansas's third largest urban area, the border briefly follows a small stream called Mill Creek. Then the Poteau River, which Mill Creek flows into for just about a mile and a half. The Poteau flows into the Arkansas River, and for just about 2,000 feet, right along downtown Fort Smith, the Arkansas River serves as the state's border with Oklahoma. Past downtown, the border turns to a diagonal line heading northwest. A few Fort Smith suburbs like West Fort Smith, Moffett, and Arcoma. Arkansas really loves its portmanteaus. They've also got a town called Arkadelphia, sitting on the Oklahoma side. West of the town of Sulphur Springs, the border turns east, and Missouri sits to the north. The border between the two runs for 248 miles, or 399 kilometers, to the St. Francis River, follows it southwest for a little, then runs briefly east once more until it meets the Mississippi, forming Missouri's Boot Heel region and carving out that little notch in northeastern Arkansas. The entirety of Arkansas sits within the watershed of the Mississippi River, one of just a few states in the country where all the rain that falls there flows out to the ocean through the same river. Tributaries like the White, Black, and St. Francis flow into the Mississippi in the flat Delta region in the state's northeast. In the south, the Ouachita flows out of the mountains that share its name and across the border with Louisiana. The Red River of the south, one of the largest tributaries of the Mississippi and the 8th longest river in the country, briefly passes through the state, flowing in from the Oklahoma-Texas border and forming part of the Arkansas-Texas border before entering the state completely just north of Texarkana and curving briefly through southwestern Arkansas before entering Louisiana. Most important to the state itself, though, is the river it takes its name from. The Arkansas River is the third largest in the Mississippi-Missouri system, surpassed in length by only the Missouri and Mississippi itself, and the sixth longest river in the country overall, behind only the Missouri, Mississippi, Yukon, Rio Grande, and Colorado rivers. By the amount of water flow itself, it's the fifth largest tributary of the Mississippi, behind the Ohio, Missouri, Tennessee, and Red. Over 1,400 miles from its mouth, in the high peaks of the Rockies just outside the old silver mining town of Leadville, Colorado, two streams fed on snowmelt from the surrounding mountains meet and form the Arkansas. From under the shadow of Mount Elbert, the second tallest peak in the lower 48, the river runs east and cuts through the Rockies, forming Colorado's stunning Royal Gorge, passing through downtown Pueblo, and running east across the Great Plains. From there, it runs through much of the length of Kansas, where most locals call it the Arkansas River. Two of sparsely populated western Kansas's larger towns, Dodge City and Garden City, sit on its banks, as does the largest Kansas city, Wichita. From there, it cuts through northeastern Oklahoma and the state's second largest city, Tulsa, before entering Arkansas at Fort Smith. With the Ouachitas to the south and the Ozarks to the north, Arkansas forms a fertile valley in the middle of the state. Towards the very center of Arkansas, the river cuts through the Ouachitas before leaving the mountains, passing through Little Rock, the state's capital and largest city, and weaving through the delta until feeding into the Mississippi near Kelso. A major divide splits the state in two, running roughly in a diagonal line from its northeastern to southwestern corners. There are, of course, differences within various parts of these two halves of the state, which I'll break down further, but roughly speaking, the north and west is a very different Arkansas from the south and east. At the root of the divide is geography. The Ozarks and Ouachitas rise up in the north and west, creating a landscape of forested mountains and rolling hills, preventing the development of much agriculture besides in the Arkansas Valley. In the south and east, the landscape is flat and fertile, low-lying enough that it's even the habitat of some 2,000 alligators. The Atlantic Ocean's coastal plain pressing deep into the interior of the U.S., all the way into southern Missouri and western Kentucky. As such, for much of the state's history, Arkansas's southeast had an economy dominated by slave labor, mostly on cotton plantations, whereas the northwest of the state had a significantly smaller enslaved population. This has had a few long-term impacts on the differences between these two halves of the state. In much of southeastern Arkansas, the plurality of the population is black, while the northwest is mostly white. After emancipation, descendants of American slavery often had very little money or possessions to their name, and another century of racial segregation made it incredibly difficult for many black Americans to build generational wealth, especially in the South. On top of that, a dependence on agriculture in general left many parts of the South where slavery was prevalent completely deindustrialized, with poor infrastructure, an economy completely reliant on crop production, and a population that earned very low wages, typically through sharecropping, the exploitative form of labor that followed slavery in much of the South. In more recent decades, the growth of a recreation economy in the mountains bypassed the Southeast as well. Maps of poverty and perhaps most starkly population growth correlate with a topographic map of the state. Since the 2020 census, only 4 northwestern mountain counties have lost population, whereas in the same time frame, only 4 southeastern lowland counties have seen any population growth. Overall, though, poverty is a problem across the state. Today, 16% of Arkansas lives in poverty, the 6th highest poverty rate of any state, and it is the 3rd lowest GDP per capita in the country, surpassed by only Mississippi and West Virginia. The south of the state is mostly flat coastal plain and low rolling hills, a mix of farms and timberlands like much of the rural South. Most of lower Arkansas's residents live on farms or in small towns. Besides Texarkana, the only larger town is Pine Bluff, a small city at the edge of the forest near the Arkansas River. Save for thick wooded areas along rivers, the east of the state is predominantly farmland. It's a massive alluvial plain of the Mississippi, an area where the rivers deposited soils and sediments through spillways along its banks and changed course, fanning out across the valley over time. Like the part of the alluvial plain across the border in Mississippi, this section of the state is known as the Delta, although some consider it part of the Mississippi Delta, while others use the name specifically to just refer to the section of the alluvial plain within Mississippi. But the Arkansas Delta shares a lot in common with its Mississippi counterpart, such as high rates of poverty, an agricultural economy, a large black population, and a history of slavery on cotton plantations, followed by sharecropping by both black and white farm workers. Though Arkansas is not usually considered a part of the Deep South, the Delta shares a lot in common with its Mississippi counterpart, which is often described as the heart of the Deep South and the most culturally southern part of the country. Today, while cotton is still big, soybeans and rice have eclipsed it as the state's top crops. Though it's the natural state's largest crop, Arkansas is the country's 10th largest soy producer, but the largest outside of the Midwest. It's huge in the cotton industry, ranking 4th in the country in cotton production after just Texas, Georgia, and Mississippi, but perhaps its most important cash crop is rice. Rice requires very specific conditions to grow that rule out a lot of the country for suitability. Very flat land, with the fields often flooded for irrigation, tons of water readily available, and hot weather. The Arkansas Delta meets all those qualifications and is easily the largest rice-growing region in America, with almost half of the country's rice coming out of Arkansas alone. Whether cotton, rice, or soy, essentially all the state's crops are produced in the Delta. There's one major exception to the flat plains that take up most of the Delta. Arcing down the northern half of the region is a range of low forested hills that rise up above the flat surroundings. Called Crowley's Ridge, this thin rise in the landscape is a remnant of the Mississippi's changes in course over time. An ancient island formed from the Mississippi, which flowed to its west, and the Ohio, which once ran parallel to the Mississippi to the ridge's east. Today, the forests of Crowley's Ridge have more in common with the flora of the Appalachians than with woodlands in other parts of Arkansas. At the base of the ridge in the state's northeast, Jonesboro is the Delta's main town, a small city of around 73,000 and in its suburbs that makes it the 4th largest urban area in the state. In the Delta on the border with Tennessee, Arkansas's Memphis suburbs, such as the city of West Memphis, are fairly small. Fewer than 50,000 people live on the Arkansas side of the Memphis area. Though nowhere near the heights of America's Mountain West, or even some of the Appalachians to the east, the mountains of northwestern Arkansas still stand out distinctly from surrounding parts of the South and Midwest. They're split by the Arkansas Valley into two distinct regions. The Ozarks north of the valley stretch west into Oklahoma, north into Missouri, and even include a tiny corner of Kansas near the town of Baxter Springs, while the Ouachitas south of the valley fold west into Oklahoma. Because of this, the landscapes of eastern Oklahoma, southern Missouri, and northwestern Arkansas really have more in common with one another than with the rest of their respective states. Besides their division by the Arkansas River, the Ozarks and Ouachitas differ in how they were formed and therefore how they look. Like many mountain ranges, the Ouachitas have been created by movement of the Earth's crust, land folding atop itself and creating long, thin ridges and valleys that stretch dozens of miles in length. The Ozarks, meanwhile, are less of a mountain range and more of an ancient plateau that's since eroded away, leaving behind knobs and domes as small mountain peaks. In many cases, these mountains are more like hills, but some sections do get pretty tall, with steep cliffs and rock outcroppings located across both ranges, like the famed Hawksbill Crag in the Arkansas Ozarks. The Ouachitas are generally taller, home to the highest point in the state and in the Ouachitas overall, Mount Magazine, while the highest range of the Ozarks, the Boston Mountains, are also located within Arkansas. The state's Wajaji summit is the highest the Ozarks reach. With little land for large-scale farming, these mountain regions of Arkansas were a part of the South with relatively little slavery, besides a presence in the Arkansas Valley. It was mostly settled by white Americans, typically of English, German, Irish descent, as well as from the Scots-Irish, an ethnic group descended from Scottish and English Protestants who settled in Northern Ireland during a period of colonization known as the Plantation of Ulster. Most of those who settled in the Ozarks were not recent immigrants, but Americans whose families had been in the country for a few generations already. Many came from the Appalachians, and the Ozarks today share a lot in common culturally with Appalachia, with a distinct regional culture forged in relative isolation from the rest of America, and a strong history of folk art and music, often making use of instruments like the fiddle and banjo. Life in these remote mountain communities and homesteads was often quite difficult, and today a growing recreation economy sits beside the reality of rural poverty for many of its inhabitants. Most of Arkansas's largest population centers sit in or near the mountains, primarily in the fertile Arkansas Valley, whose location along one of the country's longest rivers as it carves a path through the mountains made it an important center of trade and transportation. Little Rock, Arkansas's capital and largest urban area, with about 461,000 people in the city and its suburbs, is roughly in the center of the state along the Arkansas River, right where the Ouachita Mountains give way to the farmland of the Delta. It's a medium-sized city, the 88th largest urban area in the country, between Worcester, Massachusetts, and Madison, Wisconsin. Not far to the northwest in the Arkansas Valley, the 5th largest urban area in Arkansas, Conway, sits not far from the river, and right on the river, directly on Arkansas's western border with Oklahoma, is Fort Smith, a small city of around 125,000 in it and its suburbs. In the Ouachitas southwest of Little Rock, the town of Hot Springs, a beautiful mountain city home to a national park of the same name, whose bathhouse-lined downtown has historically been a popular vacation destination, is the 6th largest urban area in the state, home to around 59,000 people. The 2nd largest urban area in the state, after just Little Rock, is not a single city, but a string of 4 main cores that overlap and run together in a string of population in the very northwestern corner of the state. Collectively often just called Northwest Arkansas, this economically vibrant corridor is the fastest growing part of the state. Since 2020, each of Arkansas's 3 fastest growing counties, Benton, Madison, and Washington, sit within northwest Arkansas, and altogether the urban area is home to around 373,000 people. The southernmost of the 4 northwest Arkansas cities, Fayetteville, is the largest, a college town home to the University of Arkansas, the largest university in the state. North of it, Springdale is a major poultry production center, home to the headquarters of Tyson Foods and a huge Marshallese American community, home to thousands of Marshall Islanders drawn there to work for Tyson, so many that the area is often nicknamed the Springdale Atoll. Rogers sits north of it, followed by the town of Bentonville, whose location as the headquarters of commerce giant Walmart, the largest company in the world by revenue, as well as the world's 4th largest employer, after just the Indian, American, and Chinese defense ministries, has helped usher in a period of economic growth to this small region nestled in a relatively flat corner of the Ozarks. Nearby, recreation has been a big draw for the mountains and reservoirs of the Ozarks, and towns like Eureka Springs have become popular vacation destinations.
Through this channel, I've tried to build a community of people who want to think critically, to learn more about the world and the places we call home, to appreciate our history, both the good and the bad. Sometimes, though, it's easy to become disheartened. Ideological beliefs, unfortunately, have been pushing us into our own corners and driving a wedge between people who really would be better off getting along, making far too many of us lose sight of the most important thing about us, our common humanity. Part of the problem is the news. It's absolutely essential to understand what's going on in the world around us, but all too often a fragmented media landscape allows us to pick biased sources that reinforce what we already believe, while algorithms drive us to echo chambers that only make us more ideological instead of more informed. It doesn't have to be so bleak though, because there is a solution. Today's sponsor, Ground News.
Ground News was founded by a former NASA engineer to put the bias of the articles we read front and center. Unlike other news feeds, it shows how current events are being covered by sources from across the political spectrum. Let's look, for example, at this recent news about an abortion ballot measure in Arizona. Ground News aggregated 111 articles on it. As you can see, coverage on the topic is coming mostly from left-leaning or centrist news sources, with fewer articles written on the topic by right-leaning publications. We can also see that most of the sources covering the topic are rated as being highly credible and factual. These ratings are a combination of 3 independent news monitoring organizations that analyze things like each publication's printed language. We can even explore the ownership structure of the sources, whether they're independent publications, part of larger media conglomerates, or privately owned. Through their bias comparison tool, you can even compare how left-leaning, centrist, and right-leaning sources emphasize certain aspects of a story, and easily toggle between articles to compare how an issue is being framed. If you want to expand your news consumption beyond your own bias and get a sense for the sensationalized nature of some media, their blind spot feature allows you to explore topics that are overwhelmingly being covered by outlets from one side of the political spectrum.
Ground News provides essential context that otherwise is missing from the media on stories and perspectives from around the world. I'm really excited to work with them because for curious people, they provide a great way to stay informed without driving yourself into a toxic echo chamber of biased information. With Ground News, rise above the chaos and take the bias out of the headlines.
Check them out at ground.news/interesting and use my link to save 40% on the same Vantage plan I use for unlimited access to all their features.
Anywhere from 13,000 to 30,000 years ago, massive ice sheets stretched north and south from the planet's polar extremes. With more water frozen on the surface, the Earth's oceans were shallower, and land was exposed that today sits beneath the seas. Under what is today the Bering Strait, a land bridge we call Beringia connected Alaska to the eastern tip of Asia, Russia's Chukchi Peninsula. Scientists generally believe that through this land bridge joining North America to Asia, either across an overland route or by taking boats along the shoreline, the first people to set foot in the Western Hemisphere reached their new homeland. There isn't a complete consensus on the Bering Land Bridge theory, including among scientists or Native American tribes themselves. Several tribal traditions, though, do speak of an ancient journey eastward from across an ocean. Some, too, tell the story of an Old North Trail, a path following the eastern slope of the Rockies, from Yukon all the way to New Mexico, thought to have followed a gap in the ice sheet allowing for passage south. From the Arctic, these first Americans may have taken this pass in the ice, following the routes of game. Over the course of generations, they would have eventually emerged into a warmer land beyond the ice. They may too have followed the Pacific coast by boat to the end of the ice, but one way or another, the ancestors of the Western Hemisphere's indigenous peoples migrated to and spread throughout the continents, and over the millennia, from Greenland to the Caribbean to Patagonia, emerged into countless societies, civilizations, and ethnic groups, speaking over 1,000 languages in numerous different language families. Further back from the arrival of Europeans, we mostly rely on the archaeological record to paint a picture of indigenous American civilization. In Arkansas and throughout much of what is today the southern and midwestern U.S., lived a people we today call the Mississippians. They inhabited massive cities, built enormous earthen pyramids and temples, and controlled trade routes stretching across much of the continent. Following the expedition of Christopher Columbus, the Spanish cemented themselves from a base in the Caribbean as the dominant colonial power in the Americas. Eager to find sources of gold and silver to enrich their empire, in 1539 they sent an expedition led by the colonial governor of Cuba, Hernando de Soto, north from the island into Florida. From there, De Soto traversed what is today the American South in an often violent campaign that was both exploration and conquest. He took slaves and hostages and burned cities as he marched west. Spain had already toppled the powerful and wealthy Aztec Empire of what is today Mexico, but the powerful and flourishing Mississippian settlements De Soto encountered lacked the gold and silver the Spanish hungered for. Inadvertently, his expedition also aided with the spread of Old World diseases like smallpox, which the continent's indigenous people had no exposure and therefore no immunity to. Where they came, death followed, and diseases from Europe alone are thought to have eventually killed 90% of North America's native people. In 1521, De Soto and his men came to a great river, the Mississippi. There they encountered an incredible sight, a fleet of hundreds of ships, a welcoming party of troops led by a king named Aquixo. Instead of trying to build relationships, De Soto's men fired on them. On June 28th, the Spanish crossed the river. In the land that would later be called Arkansas, they crisscrossed a number of small but powerful countries, such as Quapaw and Koski. In what is today the Arkansas Delta, they saw walled cities home to thousands of people, centered around plazas, pyramids, and temples, surrounded by orchards and farms, and connected by an intricate network of roads. An archaeological site near the delta town of Parkin is thought to be the remnants of the capital of Koski. From there, he followed the Arkansas River upstream before doubling back and heading southeast, but De Soto's multi-year expedition ended perhaps within Arkansas. At the Mississippi River near what is today the town of MacArthur, a fever took his life, and his men weighed his body down, giving him a water burial in the river that he was the first European to lay eyes upon. His men would continue through Texas and Louisiana, but generally consider their expedition a failure. To the Mississippians, though, it was anything but inconsequential. Future European expeditions would find no great kingdoms and cities. The descendants of the Mississippians lived in scattered smaller villages or nomadically as tribes. They would be the peoples chronicled by future settlers and explorers. Though we don't know precisely what brought about the downfall of Mississippian society, it's likely that the chaos, political upheaval, and disease brought by the Spaniards played a major role. Descendants likely include the Caddo in the western half of Arkansas and the Korowa and Tunica in the southeast. Native people from what is now northern Arkansas and other areas in the central part of the Mississippi Valley migrated north over 1,000 years ago. Their descendants settled in Minnesota and expanded west into the Great Plains, where they became known as the Dakota and Lakota, collectively the Ouachita Shakowin, or Sioux. Sometime after De Soto's expedition, a tribe known as the Hoga left the Ohio Valley, from perhaps as far east as western Pennsylvania. Upon reaching the confluence of the Ohio and Mississippi rivers, a group of the tribes split off and headed down the Mississippi, while the rest continued upstream. This group that headed south would call themselves the downstream people, Ogapa, or Quapaw, and they would come to inhabit most of the state, perhaps intermarrying with local descendants of old Mississippian chiefdoms like Koski and Pakaha, and pushing groups like the Tunica and Korowa further south. The remainder of the migrants heading upstream would continue to settle in various parts of the Mississippi and Missouri valleys, branching off into the Osage and the Ozarks of Arkansas and Missouri, the Kaw in Kansas, and the Ponca and Omaha in Nebraska. All speaking languages descended from Dagiha, a Siouan dialect. Their journey west would be called the Dagihan Migration. Two Dagihan peoples, the Quapaw and Osage, would dominate the east and northwest of the state, respectively, while the Mississippian-descended Caddo would control the southwest. It would be more than a century after De Soto's death before Europeans would arrive in an Arkansas very different from the one he had explored. This time it was the French. In 1673, Jesuit missionary Jacques Marquette and a French-Canadian explorer named Louis Joliet traveled south from the Great Lakes, hoping to map the Mississippi River and perhaps extend Jesuit missions into the region. They called the Quapaw they met Arkansas, a Gallicized version of an Illinois name for the tribe, but at the meeting point of the Mississippi and the river Marquette named for the tribe, they would turn back and head upstream, worried the Spanish were nearby. Just 5 years later, a French explorer named René Robert Cavelier, Sieur de la Salle, led another voyage down the river, claiming the river valley for France and naming it La Louisiane, or Louisiana, for King Louis XIV. La Salle had built a fort, Fort St. Louis, in what is now Illinois. He left one of his men, an Italian named Enrico Tonti, whom the French would call Henri de Tonti, to hold the fort, while he went back to France to share word of the good news. But La Salle would be all out of luck. Coming back to America to continue colonization of the Mississippi Valley and Gulf of Mexico, he was unable to locate the river's mouth. His ship wrecked in Texas, his men mutinied, and he was killed. De Tonti left Illinois to search for La Salle, building a base of operations on the Arkansas River. It would be called Poste d'Arkansas, Arkansas Post. Eventually, he would find the remnants of the La Salle expedition, and with the destruction of Fort St. Louis, it was Arkansas Post, by now an outpost for fur trade with the region's native people, that for a time was the only colonial settlement in the entire Mississippi Valley. At times abandoned and moved to various locations in the region, it was part of a failed scheme by Scotsman John Law to build a French colony at the post populated by German settlers. Law would go bankrupt, the Germans would bail, but some French expeditions did settle in the area he intended to colonize around the post, although it would eventually be abandoned as anything but a military and trading post, from where France and their allies, the Quapaw, would battle the British allied Chickasaw. France continued to chart and explore the region around Arkansas Post. On an expedition up the river, they took note of an outcropping of stones by the water, calling it simply Le Petit Rocher, the Little Rock. In 1754, disputes with Britain over the contested Ohio Valley led to the 7 Years' War, the North American theater of which is often called the French and Indian War. France lost, but a year prior to their defeat, seeing the writing on the wall, they secretly gave all their colony of Louisiana west of the Mississippi, including the area around Arkansas Post, to Spain. Though now under Spanish rule, the region would remain primarily home to Quapaw, Osage, and Caddo, as well as French fur traders, their families, and slaves. Not long after, the American Revolution pitted 13 of Britain's North American colonies in the Atlantic seaboard against the mother country. France and Spain would ally themselves with the upstart colonies. In 1783, a regiment of British and Chickasaw soldiers attacked Arkansas Post, but Spain successfully defeated the invading forces. Now bordering the new United States of America, Spanish Louisiana began to become a destination for American settlers crossing the river from what was then the country's frontier west. Some moved to Arkansas Post, and a few to a town that grew up around a Spanish river fort called Campo de la Esperanza, which the Americans called by its English translation, Hopefield. For the most part, though, save for these new English-speaking American settlers and a few French fur traders and Spanish colonists, the area that would become Arkansas was mostly home to native people. European settlers to Louisiana mostly moved either further south to an area around the bustling port city of New Orleans or further upstream to the fur trading center of St. Louis. Spain had never sent many colonists to Louisiana and was having trouble ruling over a population increasingly dominated by Anglo-American immigrants from east of the Mississippi. Besides, they were running low on money, and in 1800 sold Louisiana back to their previous owner, France. France, though, was losing both money and troops trying to suppress a massive slave revolt on one of the main economic engines of their empire, the Caribbean sugar and coffee colony of Saint-Domingue, that eventually led to the colony's independence as the new country of Haiti. With troops occupied and money tight, France sold the vast colony of Louisiana just 3 years later to the United States in the famous Louisiana Purchase, nearly doubling the size of the country and the largest ever expansion of American territory besides the country's initial independence. By the next year, the Stars and Stripes had been raised over Arkansas Post, and the massive purchase had been split into two separate entities. South of the 33rd parallel, the more populous region that had been known as Lower Louisiana by the mouth of the Mississippi became the Orleans Territory, governed out of New Orleans. The rest of the purchase north of the parallel was known as the District of Louisiana and would become a territory in its own right, the Louisiana Territory, just 1 year later, with its capital in St. Louis. In 1812, the Orleans Territory was admitted to the Union as a new state, Louisiana. With its name taken, the territory to the north was renamed Missouri. The territory was split into various districts, essentially counties, for local government. As more settlers moved into the territory, one of these districts, New Madrid, was divided up, and its southern section, home to Arkansas Post, was named the District of Arkansas for its main town. By 1813, it had become Arkansas County. In 1818, the Missouri Territory applied for statehood, the discussions revolving around the more populous region around the Missouri Valley and the city of St. Louis. Most of the territory, including Missouri's 5 southernmost counties, Lawrence, Pulaski, Clark, Hempstead, and Arkansas, were not in consideration for this new state. Wanting support from the government, the few thousand white settlers in these southern counties pushed to become their own territory, and in 1819, still a few years before Missouri would successfully achieve statehood, its 5 southern counties split off, and taking the name of one of their counties and the town that would serve as the first capital city, became the territory of Arkansas, spelled for the first year ending with a W before it was changed to its current spelling ending in an S. Initially, it stretched as far south as the southern limit of the Mississippi River watershed in what is today Texas, and as far west as the Rocky Mountains in what is now New Mexico, but with the signing of the Adams-Onis Treaty with Spain in 1821, clarifying the two countries' borders, it was shrunk to the Red River in the south and the 100th meridian to the west, today's Oklahoma-Texas border. The new territory changed rapidly in the few decades following the Louisiana Purchase. Though named for a town in Missouri, the 1811 New Madrid earthquakes resulted in significant shaking in the territory, especially along the fault zone in the northeast, where overland forests dropped as the ground shifted and flooded with river water, from then on known as the Sunken Lands. Many Native Americans and settlers in the region fled to other parts of the territory. At the time of the purchase, Arkansas was mostly home to Quapaw, Caddo, and Osage populations, along with around 500 descendants of French colonists in the Delta region, centered in Arkansas Post. Only around a few hundred American settlers had moved in by 1810, but a decade later, the area's non-native population had increased 13-fold. Much of the reason was the War of 1812. After the war with Britain ended, the young country remained cash-strapped. Wars are expensive, and the U.S. didn't have the money to pay its veterans. One thing they had plenty of, though, was land. 6 million acres were set aside to be given to veterans returning from the war, a third of them alone in Arkansas, mostly the Delta. More settlers followed, many taking a series of routes between the Delta and the mountains from Cape Girardeau, Missouri, to the Red River Valley in Texas called the Southwest Trail, either staying in Arkansas or passing through on their way to Texas. The swamps of the Delta, it turns out, were difficult to settle, so through a series of treaties, the U.S. pushed the Quapaw out of their homeland. Disease and conflict with the neighboring Chickasaw had already decimated the tribe. Having once dominated Arkansas, only about 700 Quapaw remained even before American settlers began arriving en masse in the territory, and they had little choice but to accept a series of treaties which pushed them first into southwestern Arkansas and then out of the territories altogether, to live amongst the Caddo who had already left in Louisiana. As one tribe left Arkansas, though, another arrived. The Cherokee, hailing from a vast homeland in the southern Appalachians, were one of 5 tribes in the southeastern U.S. that had maintained a hold on some of their land by adopting European styles of dress and customs, land ownership, government, and religion. It worked for a time, but as the Cherokee way of life underwent a tectonic shift, many who opposed these societal changes voluntarily went west, settling in Arkansas, first the Delta and later other parts of the territory following the New Madrid earthquake, building a community of around 5,000 that became the largest tribe in the state, and splitting for the first time the Cherokee people into eastern and western bands. Famed creator of the Cherokee alphabet Sequoyah was among them. As more white settlers flooded the territory, though, the western Cherokee too were eventually pushed out. The western half of Arkansas had been returned to the federal government in 1824 after a treaty with the Choctaw was finalized, trading land there in exchange for land in what is today Mississippi. 4 years later, in 1828, the border was moved further east to its current location near the new military outpost of Fort Smith, to give the Cherokee land there and push them out of Arkansas altogether. Not long after, more eastern tribes would pass through the territory. Under the presidency of Andrew Jackson and his successor Martin Van Buren, some 46,000 Cherokee, Choctaw, Muskogee, Chickasaw, and Seminole people, members of the southeast so-called 5 civilized tribes, were forcibly removed from their homelands and sent west on a deadly march, known as the Trail of Tears. Thousands were killed on the journey westward. Their destination was the Indian Territory that had once comprised the western half of Arkansas, what would eventually become Oklahoma. Thousands died on the journey. Really a system of numerous trails, each passed through Arkansas before reaching Indian Territory. The Chickasaw and Choctaw crossed through southern Arkansas, and the paths of the Muskogee, Cherokee, and Seminole followed the Arkansas River. After passing the walls of Fort Smith, the trail would end, and they would enter Indian Territory. In 1832, President Andrew Jackson signed a bill protecting a geothermal area in the territory's Ouachita Mountains as the Hot Springs Reservation under the protection of the federal government. Though it didn't have the name, by some standards this makes it America's first national park, but the government failed to allocate money to protect it, and a town developed on the site. By the 1880s, the city, with its ornate Victorian bathhouses, would become a popular vacation destination and resort town. The Arkansas Territory had grown rapidly as settlers moved in. By 1830, it was home to 30,000 non-native people, more than double that of the previous decade. In the following decade, its population would triple. Along with German immigrants, most of the people who moved into Arkansas were, unsurprisingly, due to its location just west of the southern states, Southerners from states like Kentucky and Tennessee, or deep south states like Mississippi, Alabama, and Georgia, mostly descendants of colonists from Britain and Ireland. In the Ozarks and Ouachitas, most of these settlers provided for themselves and their families on smaller subsistence farms, whereas in southern Arkansas and the Delta, migrants from the deep south brought a cash crop, cotton, and the horrible practice of slavery that often accompanied plantation agriculture. Black Americans descended from enslaved people brought across the Atlantic from West Africa were sold on the plantations in the territory, and though during its territorial days they typically made up only 3 to 4% of Arkansas's population, the percentage of Arkansans living in chains would only continue to grow. Not long after the foundation of the Arkansas Territory, the capital city was moved. Arkansas Post was low-lying and flooded frequently, and a new location on the Arkansas River, at the waypoint known as the Little Rock, was chosen instead. The old French town from then on fell into decline. Eventually, Arkansas Post would be abandoned altogether. By the 1830s, Arkansas was among the country's more populous territories, and its residents began the push for statehood. Its neighbor to the north, Missouri, had become a state only after a long and grueling process dragged out by disagreements over the extension of slavery into new territories. The resulting Missouri Compromise essentially pushed the coming conflict off, banning slavery, with the exception of Missouri, in states north of Arkansas, and pairing Missouri's entry with that of a free state, Maine. In 1836, the Northern Territory of Michigan applied for statehood, and with it, Arkansas, hoping to be a slave state, followed suit. Though held up over a number of political disputes and concerns about its financial viability, their statehood was approved before that of Michigan. On June 15, 1836, President Andrew Jackson signed the law admitting Arkansas to the Union as the country's 25th state. Its early years would be anything but easy, however. Congress had been right to be worried about Arkansas's finances. Low taxes and an economy where most of the money was in the hands of wealthy owners of large plantations quickly set the stage for a deep recession. The town of Washington, not far from the Mexican border, was an entry point for Americans, many of whom were from Arkansas and other southern states, who immigrated to the Mexican state of Coahuila y Tejas, and later for volunteers who aided those settlers in their successful revolution against the Mexican government. Most consequential for the early state, though, would be the issue of slavery. Cotton farming had ballooned in early Arkansas. Though introduced just a few decades prior, by 1860, Arkansas was the country's 6th largest cotton producer. In the Delta, enslaved people were forced to do the grueling and dangerous task of clearing the swamps and forests to make way for farmland. As the state's population continued to rise, 97,000 in 1840 doubling to 209,000 in 1850 and 435,000 in 1860, the proportion living in slavery continued to grow as well. On the eve of the Civil War, a quarter of Arkansas toiled in chains. When the Civil War broke out, Arkansas was one of the last states to secede from the Union and join the Confederacy. Some Arkansans, particularly in the Northwest where it was less prevalent, opposed slavery, and many more opposed secession. As a number of southern states left and joined the Confederacy following the election of Abraham Lincoln as president, Arkansas held a convention to decide whether to secede or remain, and delegates voted to stay with the Union. Even after the Confederate attack on Fort Sumter sparked an open conflict, Arkansas had not yet left. But the start of the war itself and Lincoln's call for troops to take back the secessionist states changed public opinion in the state, and in May of 1861, Arkansas became the 9th state to secede from the Union and join the Confederacy. In the Ozarks and Ouachitas, many resisted Confederate rule. An underground resistance group called the Arkansas Peace Society operated in the region, and around 15,000 Arkansans left to join the Union Army, while 50,000 fought for the Confederacy. One of the most consequential Western battles in the Civil War was fought at the northwestern town of Pea Ridge, where a Union victory helped bring Missouri and northern Arkansas under Union control. In September of 1863, the Union Army took Little Rock and a Loyalist government was implemented, while the Confederate state government fled to the town of Washington. By the middle of the next year, Arkansas, thanks to victories at Pine Bluff and a failed Confederate raid into Missouri, was squarely back in control of the Union. Following the war, it and all secessionist states were placed under military government, but by 1868, Arkansas, after just Tennessee, became the second southern state to ratify the Reconstruction Amendments and be admitted to the Union. In the following years, martial law was implemented in much of the state by Governor Powell Clayton to fight the Klan's terrorist violence in a conflict known as the Militia War. A particularly dark chapter in the state was the Brooks-Baxter War. In a close election for the governorship, the losing candidate, Joseph Brooks, mustered a militia to force out the declared winner, Elisha Baxter. Skirmishes between forces led by the two candidates over the course of a month led to around 200 deaths, until a successful intervention by President Grant had Baxter reinstated. After the end of Reconstruction, segregationist Jim Crow laws and the rise of an exploitative system of labor called sharecropping kept many black Arkansans trapped in poverty and unable to exercise the rights laid out in the Reconstruction Amendments, and more than 200 were the victims of lynchings. The state changed dramatically with the end of the century. Prior to the war, Fort Smith had been a jumping-off point west as the California gold rush drew settlers towards the mountains, and after the war, as the country began to industrialize, it continued to be an important frontier town for westward expansion. Agriculture began to industrialize, and there was less demand for farm labor jobs. Many poor black and white Arkansans left sharecropping jobs for industrial or service jobs in cities like Little Rock, while the state itself saw limited growth. By 1890, its population had climbed past 1 million and was a slow climb to 1.9 million in 1940. With the onset of the World Wars, manufacturing jobs were opening up in industrial cities in the Northeast, Midwest, and West Coast, as workers left to serve overseas and a wartime economy increased industrial output. The rise of the train and automobile made it much easier for Americans to move around, and many black Southerners fled the poor economic prospects and racial segregation of the Jim Crow South for new jobs in northern cities. In 1900, black Americans made up 28% of Arkansas's population. By 1980, that proportion was down to 16%. So many left that the state's population entered a 2-decade period of decline in the 1950 and 1960 censuses, many leaving for neighboring states like Oklahoma and Texas, cities directly to the north like Detroit, St. Louis, or Minneapolis, or West Coast cities like San Francisco, Oakland, and Los Angeles. During World War II, 120,000 Japanese Americans from the West Coast were, in violation of their constitutional rights, sent by the federal government to internment camps across the country, in a period of fear and hysteria, though none were ever to be charged with a crime. All but 2 of the camps were in the Mountain West, and both were in southeastern Arkansas. Called Rower and Jerome, 16,000 Americans, mostly from Los Angeles or California's San Joaquin Valley, were interned there over the course of the war. In the 1950s and 60s, the state played a major role in the civil rights movement. After the Supreme Court's Brown v. Board of Education desegregated public schools, Arkansas's governor, Orville Faubus, refused to comply. From 1958 to 1959, the voters of Little Rock, rather than integrate their schools, voted to shut them down altogether for an entire year. The year prior, Faubus had sent the Arkansas National Guard to block a group of 9 black students who were planning to attend Little Rock Central High School as part of its first integrated class. Over the next few weeks, the Little Rock Nine, as they were known, were jeered and harassed by an angry mob as they attempted to go to school, until President Eisenhower federalized the National Guard to escort them to class. In 1950, a man named Sam Walton opened a small shop called Walton's 5 and 10 in Bentonville. By 1962, he would open a location in nearby Rogers under a new name, Walmart. Over the following decades, Sam and his wife Helen would continue to grow and expand Walmart, acquiring rivals and opening new locations in the region and beyond across the country. To the point that today, though tech companies dominate by market cap, the Little Arkansas 5 and Dime, still headquartered in Bentonville, is the largest company by revenue, not just in the United States, but in the entire world, ranking in $611 billion in annual revenue, ahead of even retail rival Amazon. It's the largest company employer on the planet and fourth largest overall employer after just the Indian, US, and Chinese defense departments, with 2.3 million employees, and has been a major driver in the economic growth of northwestern Arkansas. In fact, of the 100 wealthiest people in the United States, 7 are Walton heirs, including Jim and Rob Walton, 2 of Sam Walton's sons, who are the 12th and 13th richest Americans and the wealthiest people in Arkansas. Arkansas's largest city and its capital is Little Rock. It sits right in the center of the state on the Arkansas River where the Ouachita Mountains end and the Delta begins. Though it's the state's main population center, it's still a small city, with about 462,000 people in the urban area, the city and its suburbs, which makes it the 88th largest in the U.S., similar to Worcester, Massachusetts, or Madison, Wisconsin. It's got a nice riverfront downtown. Pretty much all the skyscrapers in the state are concentrated in the city. Little Rock's home to the 10 tallest buildings in Arkansas. The tallest is the city's Simmons Bank Tower, but it's still a small enough city that list includes a church in the state capitol. The capitol itself is a nice dome a bit outside of downtown that's essentially modeled as a replica of the U.S. Capitol. The buildings look similar enough that it's actually been used a number of times as a stand-in in movies. It's the urban heart of Arkansas and a nice southern river town not too far from the mountains. In terms of race, 71% of Arkansans are white, 15% are black, 8% are Latino, 4% multiracial, and 1.5% Asian American. It's a small population under 1%, but Arkansas interestingly is the largest Pacific Islander population outside the western U.S. Most are Marshallese. It is the largest population of Marshall Islanders outside of Hawaii. The Marshall Islands are an associated state of the U.S., a former territory that maintains a special relationship with the country. As part of it, Marshall Islanders are able to live and work freely in the U.S. without a visa and are not considered either U.S. citizens or immigrants. The mass migration of Marshallese to northwest Arkansas is largely thanks to a Marshallese man named John Moody, who, working at a Tyson Foods factory in Springdale, encouraged other Marshall Islanders to join him at the factory and successfully set in motion the migration of thousands of Marshall Islanders to the state. Most Arkansans, though, trace their ancestry back to enslaved people from Africa or immigrants and settlers from Ireland, Germany, England, and Mexico. In terms of religion, 79% of Arkansans are Christian, 3% practice other faiths, and the remaining 18% are non-religious. Most are Protestant, predominantly evangelical. Arkansas is a southern state, so of course it's home to a ton of great food, things like hush puppies, fried pickle chips, pulled pork, and catfish, and more localized dishes like biscuits with chocolate gravy, and something called possum pie, whose name seems a bit concerning, but what's essentially a delicious pie made of chocolate, cream cheese, and a pecan shortbread crust. Like in Mississippi, it's got Delta tamales, a fusion of Southern and Mexican cuisine born in the Delta, and cheese dip, like the sauce you get with chips or soft pretzels, was actually invented in a Mexican restaurant in North Little Rock in 1930. Most people speak with a variety of a Southern accent, although the Ozarks have their own distinct regional dialect similar to that of Appalachia. Music styles like country have a deep history there, and the Ozarks in particular have had a major influence on genres like bluegrass and folk music. Arkansas has no major league sports teams, and Arkansans tend to be split between teams from nearby cities like St. Louis, Dallas, or Memphis. With sports fandom in Arkansas, like much of the rural South though, it's all about college football. And unsurprisingly, the state is pretty much all for the University of Arkansas Razorbacks. Its largest newspaper is the Arkansas Democrat Gazette in Little Rock, and its busiest airport is the Bill and Hillary Clinton National Airport in Little Rock. Major universities include the University of Arkansas in Fayetteville, Arkansas State in Jonesboro, University of Central Arkansas in Conway, Arkansas Tech in Russellville, and the University of Arkansas at Little Rock. Major companies headquartered in the state include Tyson Foods, Dillard's, Americana, J.B. Hunt, and of course the world's largest company by revenue, Walmart, headquartered in Bentonville. Arkansas has by far the most dry counties where the sale of alcohol is illegal, of any state. In more than a third of the state, it's illegal to sell alcoholic beverages. Very few of the country's 63 national parks lie outside the Mountain West, and Arkansas is home to one of them. Hot Springs National Park is one of the smallest in the country, though among the more visited national parks in the U.S. It's one of my favorites in part just because of how different it is. Though Hot Springs itself isn't a huge city, it's one of the country's few urban national parks, and the beautiful architecture of Bathhouse Row gives a glimpse at the heyday of a Gilded Age resort town. There's nice trails and viewpoints into the Ouachita Mountains, beautiful fountains gush out boiling hot spring water, and the city's location tucked into a tight gap in the mountains makes for a pretty special natural setting. It's a city and national park that flies a bit under the radar but really transports you back into a different era and is honestly among my favorite towns I've visited in the U.S. Famous people from Arkansas include Glenn Campbell, John Grisham, Roger Bumpus, Johnny Cash, Douglas MacArthur, Al Green, Conway Twitty, Scottie Pippen, and Maya Angelou, who wrote about growing up in rural Jim Crow Arkansas in her book I Know What a Caged Bird Sings. For a small rural state, Arkansas has produced a number of prominent political figures in recent decades. A member of the Rockefeller business and political family, Winthrop Rockefeller, served as governor in the late 60s. Republican Governor Mike Huckabee ran for president in 2008 and won the Iowa caucus as well as a number of other state primaries, but lost the nomination to John McCain. His daughter, Sarah Huckabee Sanders, was President Trump's press secretary before her election to the governorship, and her predecessor, Governor Asa Hutchinson, ran for president in the 2004 Republican primaries but lost the nomination to Donald Trump. Easily the most famous politicians to come out of Arkansas, though, are, interestingly enough, considering the state's strong conservative lean, one of the most prominent Democratic political families in recent decades, the Clintons. The only president so far from Arkansas, Bill Clinton, was born in a small town in southwestern Arkansas called Hope and grew up in Hot Springs. At just 28 years old, he ran and lost a race for Congress, but would go on to be elected the Attorney General of Arkansas just 2 years later. He won the governorship just 2 years after that at 32, would lose re-election, but mounted a successful comeback and won 4 more terms. Essentially unknown nationally, he emerged onto the national stage, winning the 1992 Democratic nomination, defeated incumbent President George H.W. Bush, and served 2 terms in office. His presidential library is housed right on the river in Little Rock. His wife Hillary was from suburban Chicago and based her runs for national office out of New York, but began her career in political life as First Lady of Arkansas. After her time as First Lady of the U.S., she's elected senator from New York. She lost a close primary campaign in 2008 to Barack Obama, but would go on to serve as his Secretary of State, winning the 2016 Democratic nomination, the first woman ever to secure a major party nomination, but her political career would end with her loss to Donald Trump. Bill Clinton won nearly every county in Arkansas in his 2 presidential runs, but in the decades since, the state has moved rightward politically, and today the Clintons are pretty unpopular there. Case in point, Hillary lost the state in 2016 by a margin of nearly 27%. Politically, Arkansas is a deep red state, with a Cook PVI of R plus 16, meaning that in a given presidential election, the Republican nominee tends to outperform their national average by about 16% there. This makes it the 6th reddest state in America and the most Republican-leaning state I've covered so far in this series. Each of its 4 members of the House of Representatives are Republicans, as are both of its senators, Tom Cotton and John Boozman, and its governor, Sarah Huckabee Sanders. That is it for Arkansas. I want to give a big thank you to everyone who's already joined my Patreon. Through it, you can access different things such as quarterly channel newsletters, thumbnail previews, early access to maps I create, an exclusive Discord Q&A with me, and shoutouts in my videos, such as these. Also, please subscribe to my brother's channel, Quinn the Cameraman. He makes the great intro at the beginning of this video that I use in all the US Explained videos, so go show him some support. I try to be pretty thorough with this video, but I know there were definitely things I missed as there's a lot to talk about. I want to give a big thank you to everyone from Arkansas who helped give me information for this video, leaving detailed and informative comments on YouTube as well as Discord. I truly would not have been able to make this video without all your help. My next video in this series will be on Michigan, a state I just visited for the first time as part of a 6-month-long filmmaking trip across the country. From here on out, every single video in the US Explained will feature on-site clips and footage I filmed in that state. I'm super excited and I hope you are too. If you're from Michigan, please respond to my community post or my comment here, or leave something in the Discord server to let me know what you'd like to see included about your home state. Thank you for watching this video and I hope you learned something new. Subscribe for more content like this. I cover the countries, cities, people, and places of the world and beyond. These videos will leave you saying, that is interesting.